Okay, today we're going to talk about the Cote de Nuits. And over the next 2 weeks, we'll talk about the Cote d'Or as a whole. And I know that the syllabus that we wrote, we're a little bit behind. You have to remember that February the 2nd was Beaujolais, Côte Chalonnaise, and the Macon, which we included with Chablis previously. I would say today we need to certainly set aside probably 40 minutes for the presentation on the Cote de Nuits. It's about 35 slides. Next week with the Côte de Beaune, you can expect very much the same. So sort of slightly longer presentations than what we've seen perhaps in the past, but I think detailed for a reason. These regions for sure require a certain amount of time and study to truly understand them. And I think when you start studying Burgundy, it can be quite a bit overwhelming. And so what we'll try to do today is demystify that a little bit. We'll try to compartmentalize some things to make it a bit more approachable. And we can make some parallels to other regions around the world to help us try and understand that. So let's get fired up. Here's the general map of the Cote de Nuits you can find from the Society of Wine Educators on Google. I listed the mnemonic device that a buddy of mine once taught me, which is "My fairy godmother cooks very, very nice," in the old Borat voice, of course. But an important thing to know when you look at the Côte de Nuits, beyond just the general locations, you also want to take a look at, of course, more specific regions, and we'll get into each of these as we delve in a little deeper and move towards the end of the presentation. I think we'll also take a look at general Burgundy appellations, something that we brought to light with Bordeaux, and I hope was very helpful when talking about those. So we start with a little general history of Burgundy, really beginning in the 1st century of the Common Era, when the Romans' conquest of what's known as Gaul. 5th century, you see the Germanic barbarian tribesmen. And then in the 10th and 11th centuries, we begin to see the Benedictine order, which is the political and cultural center of Western Europe. The Cistercians are an offshoot of that Benedictine order that you'll see around the 12th century. And then as we move into the 15th century, we get the Valois Dukes, which Philip the Bold requires Gamay to be ripped up and replaced with Pinot Noir. And Philip the Good promoted more of the hillside viticulture. In 1443, the Hôtel Dieu in Beaune is founded by Nicolas Rollin. The Hospice de Beaune is held every 3rd Sunday in November and proceeds benefit the sick, of course, very famous. In 1790s, you start to see land seized and auctioned off during true political upheaval of the area, which leads us to the 1804 Napoleonic Code, requiring inheritances to be split equally among heirs, and really the fracturing of Burgundy begins here. The 19th century is really sort of the rise of negociants due to that Napoleonic Code. People would own a row of vines. They couldn't necessarily, as we see down here in 1920 is when domain bottling begins. So you owe a row of vines, what are you going to do with it? You want to sell it so that it can go into somebody's wine, which leads to these negociants. And 2 different major styles here of selling your wine. There's sharecropping, otherwise known as métayage, or then you could lease the vineyard site or the row of your vines, as it were, which is called fermage. In general, climate for Burgundy is continental, and as we can expect in many continental climates, frost and, of course, hail in lower areas. As you get to the hilltops, and I think we talked a little bit about this when we mentioned the Côte Chalonnaise, you see sort of harsher climate on those hilltops because you lose the protection of the forest and those westerly winds. So here your grapes actually ripen quite a bit later. Here you'll also find, just in general, more autumn rains. You'll see a lot of mildew and disease in Burgundy that can be difficult to deal with. Of course, when we talk about frost, we mentioned on a previous slide, and when we talked about Chablis, things like smudge pots, of course, to ward away any of those frost and hail issues. And then the oak coat, which is the further west areas, typically ripen up to a little bit of a week later than in the valleys. Although if you've got a truly hot vintage in Burgundy, if you think of 2003, those really benefit the oak coat wines. Local cuisine, I always like to point out, particularly when we're in the EU, because some of these have protected designations as well. So you'll see Charolais beef to the west, poulet de Bresse, or breast chicken in the east of Burgundy, and then famous cheeses Epoisse and Chapsté. I'm terrible at pronouncing that second one, by the way. Aspect and geography of the area, of course, the Côte d'Or means the golden slope, right? So these are generally eastern-facing slopes. As you get to Beaune, it starts to bend westward, which gives you a more general southeastern-facing slope. Your elevation here is from 4 to about 500 meters. Typically, your Grand Crus are at 10% or less of a slope, so a little flatter than, say, some of the escarpment. And then a word that you're going to find on labels of Burgundy quite a bit is combe. Whether it's combe d'Orvaux or combe d'Or, or all these different combes that you'll see. A combe is a dry transverse valley that serves as a conduit for cool breezes and hail. Alluvial fans of pebble and stone at the mouth of it really diversifies their soil. Your typical average domain in Burgundy is about 18.5 acres. Soil types, Burgundy as a whole lies along an exposed fault line, so you get a lot of that decomposed shellfish, which is rich in calcium, and it dots the landscape, right? So you see the limestone escarpment, and the term escarpment is a sort of a steep slope, right? So we get that slope, marl stone layer just above that, and then you get silt and scree above the marl, where the best wines are kind of made. And this is an interesting little picture you can look at to sort of get an understanding of it. But you see that limestone area here, more marl, and then it climbs up to some more calcareous clay, and then moves into more just straight clay. Pinot Noir is, of course, probably the king of grapes here in Chardonnay, but there's a handful of others that are produced in Burgundy. For Pinot Noir, I think it's important to note that Selection Massal, or Massal selection, is king. Pardon me, I didn't mean to jump to that. Chardonnay, which I put the parentage here of Pinot times Gouais Blanc. Remember that Pinot is parent to quite a few things. There's also Pinot Blanc, which of course is a mutation of Pinot Noir, Aligote, Birote, which is what they call it in Burgundy, otherwise known as Pinot Gris, César, Tresot, and Sassy, which you'll see, of course, much less, more blending grapes than anything. Viticulturally, you see planting density and yield restrictions really tighten as you start to scale that quality pyramid. I didn't put the quality pyramid on this presentation, but it's something that you might see. That sort of shows a pyramid, the top 1% being Grand Cru, the next, I can't remember if it's like 17% being Premier Cru, and the remainder truly being your Village level wines. Very much something that we learn when we start to study wine, and something I think you'll find is important to look at when you start looking at those planting densities and yield restrictions. Typically, your Premier Cru, of course, has lower yields, and then onto your Grand Cru, with some of the lowest yields and wine production period. As we mentioned earlier, want to always take a look at the general appellation wines at your Village level stuff. Bourgogne AOP rules, styles, and ensauvagement listed here. For Blanc, you can do Chardonnay and Pinot Blanc, and then a max of up to 30% Pinot Gris. They do allow for Blanc Premier or Nouveau. There's also Rosé, Pinot Noir, and Gris, plus a mixed 15% of plantings of Chardonnay, Pinot Blanc, and César, and then in the Yonne, up to only 10% there. For Rouge, Bourgogne AOP, it's Pinot Noir plus max 15%. You can see of Chardonnay, Pinot Blanc, Gris, and César. And Beaujolais Cru AOCs, Gamay may account for up to 30% of this vineyard. Varietally labeled Gamay must be from the Beaujolais Cru AOCs. Tresot may be used for red wines, but may not be replanted. So you'll see less and less of that coming on. Bourgogne AOP Blanc, your Pinot Gris, of course, may not exceed 30%. This is assemblage, which is your final blend. Previously, we were showing ensauvagement, which is your field plantings. César may not exceed 49%. Gamay may not exceed 30% for Rouge. You can see Gamay minimum 85% for labeled as Gamay, as all the other EU stipulations list. Haute Côte, which means the high slopes, which are sourced from those scattered low mountain vineyards to the west that we had mentioned previously. And then you'll see Cote de Nuits Village, which are red or pretty rarely white. Of course, the whites would be from Fixan. And you also have Brochon, Prissé, Courgalogne, and Comblanchon, which are sort of the opposite ends of the Cote de Nuits, the north and the south here. Bourgogne Aligote has to be 100% Aligote, allows for Blanc, Premier, and Nouveau, and of course is the base for the Cure cocktail with creme de cassis. Not to be confused with Cure Royale, which of course is a sparkling version. Bourgogne AOP, Bourgogne Mousseux AOP. This does allow for Vin Mousseux Rouge, which is pretty interesting, right? Your principal grapes here, Pinot Noir and Gamay. Accessory, you can blend in a little bit of these whites and a few other things. Your Chardonnay, Pinot Gris, and Blanc may not exceed a mix of 15% of the plantings. Your accessory varieties may not exceed 49% of the blend. These are traditional method production with 9 months lees aging at 3.5+ atmospheres of pressure. So again, keep in mind, when you hear Bourgogne Mousseux, it is Rouge. Passetu Grand, one of my favorites. Great value, of course. Rosé can be produced here. Minimum 30% Pinot Noir, minimum 15% Gamay, and then maximum 15% endings of Chardonnay, Pinot Blanc, and Pinot Gris. The Rouge, this is a spelling error here, is the same as for Rosé, and your assemblage is the same per encépagement, but must be vinified together. Coteau Bourguignon, for Blancs, you'll see Aligote, Melon de Bourgogne, Chardonnay, Pinot Blanc, Pinot Gris, kind of a mix of things, right? Again, it allows for Premier and Nouveau. Premier is misspelled here. I'll fix that when I send it to you guys. Rosé or Clairette, you'll find principal grapes of Gamay, Pinot Noir, and Gris, with a handful of others that we see commonly. Rouge, principal again, Gamay and Pinot Noir. So we're starting to see a lot of the same things, right? The usual suspects coming into play here. Cremant de Bourgogne is where you'll find Vin Mousseux Blanc and Rosé, right? So your Bourgogne Mousseux covers the Rouge, and then Cremant de Bourgogne covers your Blancs here. As you can imagine, Chardonnay, Pinot Blanc, Aligote, so on and so forth. There are some requirements to assemblage, minimum 30% Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Gris, Blanc, max 20% Gamay. This was established in 1975. They're hand harvested, which is important to note. And as we mentioned during the Côte Chalonnaise presentation, Rouy is truly the epicenter for production of Cremant de Bourgogne. Again, 9 months lees, 12 months to release. There's a couple of additional labeling terminology that you might want to know, and Eminent, which is 24 months on the lees, and then Grand Eminent, which is 36 months on the lees, additional 3 months after disgorgement. Your approved varieties here, Chard and Pinot, maximum 20% Gamay for Rosé, and it has to be brut or drier and a minimum actual alcohol of 10%. So that's sort of the general appellation Burgundy as a whole. I think, again, it's always important to start there before we move into the more specific regions, because, again, we see a lot of those typical players of a region as far as grapes are concerned and terminology and labeling laws. And then as we move into the smaller areas, we'll see where they tighten up their regulations. Vinification techniques, as far as Burgundy is concerned, the 228-liter piece for oak aging, and then Malo is actually pretty common in white wines. Something that I think they just don't bother with stopping, right? Terminology here, a couple of things. There were Lou Dietz approved in 1990 as geographical designations that you can append to Bourgogne AOP. Those are listed here: La Chapelle Notre Dame, La Chapitre, Côte Saint-Jacques, not to be confused with Clos Saint-Jacques, and Montrecule. And then Côte de Nuits top regions, I wanted to point out here: Mary-le-Fussy, Magny-le-Vielle, Villers-Fontaine, and Bevy. General wine laws for the regional appellations. I put applications here, that should be appellations. 4-tier hierarchy, of course, regional is about 50% of the production. Village, Premier Cru are legally defined geographic designations of Village wines, and then that 2% of Grand Cru, right? And then your monopole Grand Crus, if you think of, you know, La Tâche and Romani Conti and things like that, have got to be hand harvested. So as we begin to look from the north to the south, we start up in Marsanne, and you can see north facing up this way, and then we move south. So north to the right-hand side of the screen, moving to the left side south. And here in Marsanne, you'll see your encépagement requirements for Blanc, Rosé, and Rouge, driven again by Pinot Noir and a max of a few other things. And then your assemblage, Blanc with a maximum 30% Pinot Gris, Rosé and Rouge as well. Some great wines here. I think it can be difficult to learn Burgundy in today's environment just because some of the wines have priced themselves out of the ability for many sommeliers to get their hands on them. So having come up a few years earlier than some others, I've been able to drink a few things and been able to visit a few times. And so I feel very fortunate that I've gotten to see some of these great wines. Today, it can be a bit more about finding value from the area, and I think you can certainly find some from Marsanne for sure. Cuisine, here you'll see a couple of Premier Crus, La Perrier, Les Arvelets, Clos de Chapitre. Of course, fantastic wines coming from the area. You can see those Premier Crus listed here, Les Arvelets, La Perrier, and Clos de Chapitre, as we get closer to Bourgogne in the south, right? Moving further south, then we see Cuisine here, right, in Bourgogne. And then we get into the real, I guess you can call it the tenderloin of Burgundy, right, as we start to get to the truly great vineyards. And this is Gevrey-Chambertin. Gevrey-Chambertin, largest village appellation of the Côte d'Or. Of course, it has 9 Grand Cru, which are listed here. And you can see them really at the heart of Gevrey-Chambertin here, right? So Chambertin, Clos de Bez, Chapelle Chambertin, Charme Chambertin, Griot Chambertin, La Trissier Chambertin, Mazy Chambertin, Mazoyer, and Rouchotte, all through this area. Here you'll find a denser structure to the wines, certainly darker fruit. Some of your great producers here, of course, Armand Rousseau, Claude Dugat, Jean-Marie Fourier. You'll find rich soil, excellent shelter provided by the hills here. You'll find narrow marlstone outcrop topped with that silt and scree that we had mentioned earlier. Only Clos de Bez may append the name Chambertin before its own and not after it, right? Everything else you'll see here says Chambertin after. This is Chambertin Clos de Bez, right? Note the far west and east stretch of Gevrey-Chambertin here. So we're looking at west and all the way to the east, right? Stretches pretty far if we look at the wide side of it. And the best Premier Cru are on the slope, right? So we're looking up here at Casatière, Le Clos Saint-Jacques, Lavaux Saint-Jacques, and Le Varwell. And that's the Premier Cru slope that really produces some of the greatest wines. I mean, we realize that this was codified many years ago, and the Grand Crus, of course, are fantastic. But I think in today's world, your Clos Saint-Jacques wines might stand up to a lot of those Grand Crus, and they certainly do when it comes to pricing. You'll see here, as I mentioned before, those transverse valleys. Here's Combe, which is an important one to note as well. And then as you get further south, I think it's also important to know about Acombote. That's one that you'll find on some pretty fantastic labels. As we move further south from Gevrey-Chambertin, we get into Maurice Anthony, and a much more compressed area, right? And it doesn't have the west to east stretch that you do in Gevrey-Chambertin. It's sort of a middle ground in style between Gevrey and Chambon-Musigny. Here there are, of course, 4 Grand Cru, and these are the clos, right? So you think of Clos de la Roche, Clos de Tart, Clos de Lambray, and of course Clos Saint-Denis, the namesake, which you'll find right in here. And those are your Grand Cru for Maurice Anthony. Sort of easier to remember, right? But one of the Grand Cru that kind of stretches across both Chambon-Musigny and Maurice Anthony is Le Bon Mar. So that technically counts. It's a small little sliver in Maurice Anthony. The majority of it, of course, falls within Chambon-Musigny. Producers that you'll find of Maurice Anthony that are fantastic, of course, are Dujac, famous for whole cluster selection, and then Ponceau, right? Clos de Montluisant, which is a stony high elevation and allows for Aligote up in this area, which is pretty fun. And Montluisant is important to note too, in that it stretches across Village, Premier Cru, and into Grand Cru as well, which is pretty cool. I think it's the only one of its type in Burgundy. Chambon-Musigny, as we get further south, of course, to the north here is Maurice Anthony. Here's that little sliver. It shows it a lot better on Chambon-Musigny for Bonne Noir. And Chambon-Musigny's Grand Crus really are Bonne Noir, Clos de Vougeot, and Musigny, which sits here. Really just the three, but Clos de Vougeot being the size that it is, helps to pick up some of the volume of wine that's produced that's at Grand Cru here. In my opinion, this is perhaps my favorite region of Burgundy. And it may not be that I love drinking the Grand Cru wines. I mean, great if you can get a hold of them, but some of the great Premier Cru wines come from Chambon-Musigny. And we can take a look at a few of these things. You'll see another comb here, Le Combe d'Arvaux here in the south. I think it's important to note too, things like Le Croix, Le Feuille, Le Grand Chez, right? Acquembote, Abaubrun, Le Baude, and most importantly, Lamoureuze. Lamoureuze, along with Clos Saint-Jacques, I think if you look at today's pricing, typically Lamoureuze comes out somewhere around the 8th or 9th most expensive wines in Burgundy when it's put on a label, which means that it beats out, you know, sometimes 23, 24 other wines that are labeled as Grand Cru. Lamoureuze, of course, is always probably more expensive than just about any Clos de Vougeot wine that you can find. The fun thing about looking at these names on the Premier Cru, you can sort of get a history of what's going on here. You get Abaubrun, the tall, handsome man. You get Lamoureuze, which is the love, Le Charme, of course. You'll find one, and I can't seem to remember exactly where it is on the map, but it's called Derrière de la Grange, which is behind the garage. So you'll find the love of the tall, handsome man behind the garage. I don't know what happened here in order to get all of that labeled as such, but it was certainly something. So Chambon-Musigny, as I mentioned, sort of my favorite. They lean towards elegance. You see floral tones, much lighter fruit to it. Again, we mentioned the two Grand Cru. Musigny here, steep enough to encourage replacing the soil with brown, limey clay from the bottom of the hill. The best Premier Cru, again, we mentioned Amoureuse, Grand Chez, Feuille, and Le Charme. Great producers of the area, Comte de Vogüé, Georges Romier, which is, of course, run by Christophe now, Ghislain Barthaud, Christophe Perromino, and perhaps one of the best, Jacques-Freddy Meunier. Some of my favorite wines, and if you ever get an opportunity to visit, please look into doing so. We mentioned Clos de Vougeot being in Chambon-Musigny, not really. It kind of, you know, Vougeot is its own thing. Clos de Vougeot, of course, that Grand Cru accounts for almost 80% of the planted acreage here. The lower in the vineyard is much better for the drier vintages. The middle, and particularly the top, produce the best wines today. So as you get further away from the highway, you have a tendency to find, and this is the RN74, which is now labeled as the 974, I think is what it is today. As you get further away from that highway, you'll find better plots within Clos de Vougeot. You'll have to really, there are some fun maps that you can dive into and find, you know, site-specific areas where there's different producers, and I certainly recommend taking a look at those. There's 4 Premier Cru here: Le Petit Vougeot, Le Croix, Clos de Perrier, and Le Clos Blanc. As we get further south, and again, right north here, we start to see Vosne Romanée. And this is probably the area with the most expensive wines in all of Burgundy, and the most sought after and the most difficult to find. And if you find someone that, you know, walks into your restaurant and tells you they like to drink Vosne Romanée wines, well, you can expect that they've got a nice pocketbook for spending on wine for the evening. Here you can see the Grand Cru in the darker red. The Premier Cru are sort of in the slightly mauve color, and then almost pink. You'll find the Village level wines, which are very little. It's only Aureas, right? Everything else is Premier Cru. So it starts really with Echezot. Le Grands Echezot and Echezot here are sort of the largest of the group. Perhaps the most famous, then we get down into this little area, of course, Le Romani, Romani Conti, Le Grand Rue, La Tâche, Richebourg, and Romani Saint-Vivant, many of which are monopole. In fact, La Tâche, La Romani, Romani Conti are monopole. And I think Le Grand Rue is. I think that's Francois Lamarche, if I recall correctly. You'll also see these great Premier Crus too, Orvaux, Le Beaumont, Les Suchot. Look at Les Suchot. It splits the Grand Cru, and it's sort of on the north end of Richebourg. This is a great area for production of wine. Al Brûlé, really important one here. You'll find Al Malcolm Sort, and you'll even see some wines labeled as Cuvée Christian, which are sort of locked out of La Tâche many years ago that will price themselves up to about the same. But perhaps most famous and most important would be Creux Parentu. Today owned by Emmanuel Roger and Mayo Camazet, of course made famous by Henri Jaillet, which many people believe to be one of the greatest producers of Burgundy of all time. Meticulous attention to detail. It was sort of a higher elevation site that many people didn't believe had the right soil type for growing fantastic Pinot Noir. And he, with his winemaking techniques and attention to detail, has certainly proved that otherwise. Many of these bottlings, of course, are the rarest in the world. I've seen some 1990s and 1996s going for, 5-digit prices for sure. And they're obviously becoming more and more rare as Jaillet passed away. Production was passed on to his offspring. I guess Emmanuel Rouget is a cousin somewhere, or a nephew, if I recall correctly. But really, really fantastic wines. If you ever happen to stumble upon one, buy it if it's not out of your price range. We mentioned Le Romani being a monopole of Comte Leger Bel Air. This is the smallest AOP in all of France. Here, La Tâche, the monopole of DRC. Romani Conti, again, DRC, with a slightly poorer, shallower soil type than what you see. Le Grand Rue with Francois Lamarche, the largest of the group belonging to Richebourg, which sort of curves up to face east, northeast. And then Romani Saint-Vivant, perhaps the deepest, richest in clay and lime when it comes to the soil. The Premier Crus all touch a Grand Cru, except for Michel Gros' Clos de Reyes. Your great producers here, of course, the Maine de la Romani Conti, Comte Leger Bel Air, Anne Gros, Jean Griveaux, Mayo Camazet, Sylvain Catillard, Emmanuel Rouget, and I didn't list Henri Jaillet because he's no longer producing wine, but of course those wines are phenomenal. Fleshy Echezot, we sort of mentioned it's not really an appellation, though the commune houses the two Grand Crus. Here you've got 38 hectare over 80 individual parcels. Your Grands Echezot, of course, being the smaller, considerably better quality. If you're looking to get into drinking the Maine de la Romani Conti, this is your opportunity to drink Grand Cru at a reasonable price. I mean, you're still going to pay 4 figures probably for Echezot in most cases. But if it's on your bucket list, this is your chance to get into it. As we get further south, you can see we continue on this sort of path of the right side of the screen is north, and the southern part goes here. We find ourselves in Nuits Saint-Georges. And here you can see the Premier Crus of Nuits Saint-Georges. No Grand Crus yet. There have been, of course, rumors, and perhaps Les Saint-Georges will get, here in the south, will get elevated. Hasn't occurred just yet. But you can see the Premier Cru kind of cutting through the center of it in the purple, and then your Village level wines on the outside of it here. So here at the north, you reach towards Vosne Romanée, and really this side tend toward lighter, more elegant styles. Typically, they're pretty long-lived and sturdy. Your great producers of Nuits Saint-Georges include Henri Gouge, Confiron, Joseph Faveley, Chevillon. We mentioned Les Saint-Georges in the south being a potential elevation to Grand Cru. The Premier Prissy wines are also labeled as Nuits Saint-Georges. Your Clos de l'Arlot and Clos de la Marechal are some of the best examples just south of Les Saint-Georges. Clos de Marechal, of course, produced by Jacques-Frédéric Meunier, one of my favorite wines out there. Largest landowner, as far as producers are concerned, your largest landowner in all of the Côte d'Or is Bouchard, which of course Negociant owns about 130 hectare. You'll find Favely as well, with about 80% of its fruit actually sourced from the family domain. I think we talked about their wines the other day when we spoke about Mercure. They've gotten significantly better in recent vintages. Not to say that they were bad per se, but I think they're certainly ascending. Then you see sort of cult negociants here. Lucien Lemoine, Remoissonnet, Laurent, Verger. Some that are both domain and negociant, which is always important to note. Leroy, Dujac, and Demonty. So it's hard to figure out, okay, is this Leroy wine, does it come from their domain, or is it from something that they've sourced via negociant? And so it's important to do the research on that and be able to find out, okay, these Leroy wines are from their estate domains, and they produce them from the ground up, they grow them, and they produce them here. And then these are their plots that are negociant that they source. You could typically find a difference because of price point. That sort of helps you figure it out. But if you're writing a wine list for a large program, I think it's important to separate those things. And it's something we did at a famous Grand Award steakhouse that I was able to work with several years ago. Your best negociants drew on Louis Jadot, Louis Latour, and Monniard Meunier from the Vineyard Brands portfolio. And then, you know, I really hate to give people a vintage chart. I think, you know, I've said this in the past, these are things that you need to experience for yourself and not get caught up in. A good example here is 2008, getting all of the poor press, I guess, for Burgundy. I love those wines. I think they're lean and excellent. You can find great values. We used to have some 2008 Negociant Monniard Meunier Richebourg on our wine list for around $400. That was a hell of a value. But I would say other things, you know, the 2002, kind of a cooler vintage, I think they're delicious. They're phenomenal. 03, keep in mind that was that super hot vintage. The 04 vintage is one that you need to keep in mind for what we call the greeny me's. Some people believe that there was a ladybug issue at harvest causing a release of sort of pyrazine-like things into a lot of the wines. So keep that in mind when you're looking at 04s on wine lists or happen to find them. That's my presentation for the Cote de Nuits. I hope it sort of helps to demystify a few things. I hope it was good that we could look at some of the different regions in a more in-depth area. I think, of course, there's always deeper digging that you can do, and I encourage you to do so. We looked at Chablis, Côte-Jalonnais, Beaujolais, and the Macon last week. We'll look at the Côte de Beaune with next week's presentation. I would set aside a good 30 or 40 minutes for that and be prepared for it. And then after that, I think we should get back on track as far as the schedule is concerned. Again, if any of you have questions, if you want to throw anything my way, feel free to send me an email. I love chatting about Burgundies. These are some of my favorite wines in the world. And keep in mind, too, that, you know, I know we're sort of going in a linear progression from the north to south through Burgundy with our presentation style. Please break these things up. Study the Côte de Nuits with South Africa. You know, study the Côte de Beaune with New Zealand. Compartmentalize these things so that you don't overlap when it comes time to try and recall at an exam setting or even, you know, in a retail setting or tableside. Have a happy Sunday, everybody. Cheers. We'll catch you next week.